I am Lant Pritchett. I am the research director of the RISE program, and I am chairing this session. In this session, we are going to hopefully, for those of you who have been wondering why the research project has the word systems in it and what that might mean, even though so far we've paid a lot of attention to the evaluation of specific interventions, in this session I think we're going to move to sort of thinking about how systems fit together, work together, how the pieces fit. And we are going to have 4 presentations. We're going to start with Brian Levy, who has done a really wonderful book on South Africa, where he compares both South Africa's average performance and particularly performance between 2 of the provinces to analyze how the system works from the political settlement to the mode of governments, to the mode of governance generally, to the education sector. And a great book which I recommend and which we have been drawing on as part of the RISE program. So he's going to speak about that. We're going to have a presentation on accountability and trust and how accountability and trust need to or do not or need or move together. And so how you create accountability and trust together, hopefully. We are going to discuss scaling up successfully, which looks at the scaling up of a national literacy program in Kenya that, by all accounts, particularly Ben Piper's, has been enormously successful. And he's backed, of course, with hard evidence. So Ben is going to talk about just what it takes, and this will be frightening, but he will talk about just what it takes to really scale a national program. And then, just to illustrate the difficulty and perils of working at the system level, our paper that was scheduled for today has been blocked for political reasons at the last minute, which is a natural part of the process, when things get close to home, people have views on them. And instead, we're going to substitute a really interesting presentation about a key part of the system and how we hope to drive the system towards higher performance is by measurement. And we're going to have a paper by Abhijit Singh on data integrity and what we can learn from the integrity and reliability of the actual data systems about how that affects systems. Okay? Great. So we're going to go in that order as we have done. I've warned all the speakers that we really are going to stop them at 15 minutes, politely at first and then very rudely. And then that gives us plenty of time for questions from the audience at the end. Okay.
Great, thank you. So one of the things that makes this both a pleasure for me and somewhat intimidating is that I have spent most of my career working at the intersection of governance and development broadly, with only a distance from education until this book and this research program, which began about 7 or 8 years ago. So what I'm going to give you is a take on the education and the education system from the perspective of someone whose career focus has been the governance-development interaction. What helped me with this is the book was produced with a series of co-editors and co-authors, 2 others who work in the areas of political science and public administration, plus 2, Ursula Hoadley and Louis Crouch. There's Louis, who are in fact much more deeply embedded in the education space. So that gives me some comfort. What is also challenging is that to try to tell the story of a book in 15 minutes with Lant promising to be rude is quite a challenge. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and just develop 2 propositions, and both propositions are variations on a theme which in my time spent with the education community I think is a really important one. And it's the theme of the difference in the interplay if one's seeking to improve learning outcomes between focusing on systems, be it the detail of the specific systems of pedagogy, be it the detail of bureaucratic systems, versus the evocation of agency. And I'm just going to tease out 2 propositions on that theme from the book. The way I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do that with a framework which I think is Dion still here? Which is from the 2018 World Development Report. So I'm going to assume that in this group, everybody is familiar with the 2018 World Development Report framework, but I want to just flag the quote that's there as a point of departure. The point of departure being, as this WDR flagged, we can think of the education system as 3 concentric circles, that there are huge interdependencies between them, and as a result of the interdependencies associated with a complex system, one can be caught in a low-level equilibrium trap. And what the WDR very usefully does is it distinguishes between 2 dimensions through which a system might function. The dimension of, is the system coherent? And the dimension of, is the system aligned to learning? And when you think of the world through that, you end up with this 2x2 frame, where there's the sweet spot, the high-performing learning-oriented system, but there are also 2 kinds of traps that emerge. The trap of being coherent in process compliance, and the trap of being coherent, but of not being coherent, but being fragmented. And what we're going to do in this work is we're going to be thinking about those 2 kinds of traps and how one might address them. Because I'm a governance person, and because I'm the kind of governance person who's always trying to make sense of incentives and constraints and then look for entry points for cumulative change, I tweak this a little bit. And I tweak the picture as follows. So that what we now have is we're now interested in these 2 corner problems. The problem of the fragmented system that's not aligned to learning. What do you do? Not how do you leap to there? Assume you get there is great, but the world doesn't work that way. What do you do next? Or the problem of being highly coherent, but coherent around process compliance rather than be coherent around learning. And because of where I'm going to go with this, I want to basically immunize myself against the claim that I'm saying systems don't matter, because I'm not saying systems don't matter. What I'm saying is that as a group with a commitment to change, here are the ways in which systems could help. Systems can help if you have good enough alignment to learning. You can improve the system in the sweet spot. Or if you're in this space and you have flexibility to move, systems can help you to move by getting better infrastructure, better delivery of textbooks, getting teachers in the right place. But the dilemma which we're going to look at is the dilemma of 2 provinces in South Africa. South Africa has a system in which implementation of education is delegated down to the provincial level. The book looks at 2 provinces. One is the Western Cape, which I'll come to second. The other one is the Eastern Cape. And the interesting feature of these, as you can see where I've located them, is that they capture both of the dysfunctions. Let me look briefly first at the Eastern Cape. A central theme of the book, a central theme of my work on governance for the last 20 years, is political and institutional context can constrain the scope for bureaucratic improvement. When you're in an environment with a set of characteristics, and these are the dimensions that are key to the Eastern Capes, is the politics fragmented? Is the bureaucracy personalized? Is the setting dualistic? When all of those come together, you can find yourself trapped in a perfect storm in which the question of what do you do? You can't solve that by saying, let's get better bureaucracy, because you're stuck. So what we did in the research is we went down to the school level. And we asked the question, what scope is there for agency at the school level? I have a series of slides that I'm going to... Oh, one feature I do need to note for where I'm headed is that in South Africa, along with the delegation to the provincial level for implementation, there is also delegation of substantial governing authority to school governing bodies in which parents are the majority. So the question that arises is school level governance an entry point for trying to improve learning outcomes in the settings that are captured over here? So in order not to sort of hit the time constraint too hard at the end, I'm going to skip these 2 slides on schools and just from the Eastern Cape and just come to this one. And then let me share with you what we learned. What we did in this research, and the book's available online. It's a free download from Oxford University Press's Open Access, is we looked closely at we took a set of matching pairs of schools, all neighboring schools in low-income settings, and we traced the patterns of governance over time in those schools, including all those schools' changes in school leadership. And what we found in our careful case studies, it was 2 matching pairs in the Eastern Cape, is contrary to some priors. We did not find that a single proposition which said, well, all these schools are captured by the unions, or all these schools are captured by this or that. That did not hold. What we learned in these cases, small n, so we learn about causal mechanisms rather than learning outcomes. What we learned in these cases, rather than large volume generalizations, what we learned saw in these cases is that the dynamics of governance and power and outcomes in the school was contingent and cumulative, shaped by hyper-local dynamics. And so the way I think now of this question of can you get gains by intervening at the school level is like this. It depends on how you understand the distribution of power at that hyperlocal level. If you're in a setting where the balance of power at that hyperlocal level is reasonably balanced between developmental and predatory actors, or if you like, the distribution of their relative weights looks something like this, then there is significant scope for achieving gains in learning outcomes by investing to strengthen participatory governance. If, however, you're in a setting where the distribution looks like this, the gains from through participatory governance are limited. That's all I'm going to say on that, mindful of time. Let me move on to the second province, which is the Western Cape province. And this is the province that surfaces powerfully the dilemma of process compliance. 2 chapters in the book look in depth, well, one, the Eastern Cape bureaucracy, another at the Western Cape bureaucracy. I look in depth at that bureaucracy. The Western Cape bureaucracy, by the criteria which we use when we evaluate the quality of a bureaucracy in a conventional Weberian sense, is a high-quality bureaucracy. It does all the things you want a bureaucracy typically to do rather well, and it has, and I'm going to use some language from some of Lant's work, it has strong, thin accountability systems, very strong performance management systems driven from the top. They are truly and genuinely impressive. However, the learning outcomes that you see in the Western Cape are, when you benchmark, and the benchmark that we used was the benchmark of Kenya, a country with a per capita income that is 1/5 of the Western Cape's, the learning outcomes, and this is, by the way, using a 2007 standardized test that's sort of Southern and Eastern Africa, the learning outcomes in the Western Cape are mediocre. Well, a lot of econometrics we've seen. We also have in the book an econometric study which has a dummy for what we call the Western Cape effect. And indeed, we see this Western Cape governance effect is positive relative to the Eastern Cape and is negative, controlling for a bunch of other variables relative to Kenya. And the question is why? And to answer that question, the proposition that I'm putting to you is the proposition that the Western Cape is trapped in this world of a trap of process compliance, of the black hole of process compliance within accountability. What does that look like when you get to the school level? 3 stories for you. And the data that you're seeing here are the results of standardized tests, school-level standardized tests in the Western Cape. I'll just quickly run through three cases, and then I will sum up with some conclusions. This case. This is a school, which apparently there are a lot of schools in the Western Cape that look like this. I happen to have spent time with this one. This is a school, you walk into it, and it looks like a high-performing school. All the kids are wearing uniforms, the school is tidy, the classroom and the walls all look fantastic. The learning outcomes, when you control for the other variables, are poor. And when you drill down into the details of the governance of the school, you discover that what you have is a low-level equilibrium of mediocrity. And that low level of mediocrity is reproduced, and we document this, in the way that this leadership succession happens. Make a point of excluding leaders that would break that cycle, and in fact, frankly, identifying for succession a leader that would sustain that. So that's one example. Second and third examples are fascinating. These are 2 schools that were selected, these were done carefully, as I said, with matched pairs, they were selected because they were high-performing schools relative to their socioeconomic characteristics. But when we learn more about them, we discover that they're high-performing in a very particular way. They're high-performing because they are led by a charismatic top-down principal who sucks all authority to him or herself and leaves a vacuum of participation and governance at the school governing body level. And when those principals exited, and we document this for both the schools, when those principals exit, what you have is you have in both cases a collapse of the test scores and the learning outcomes. Another example of thin accountability and its limits. There's a third example for which my time is my time is too limited to get into. It's the counter example. It's the one example, the outlier, where you actually had participatory governance, which self-corrected to some extent when the test scores came out and showed weaknesses in results. Contrast that with Kenya. Kenya, which is a positive outlier relative to expectations in the Southern and East Africa. Now, one of my pleasures in this particular conference has been to finally meet Ben Piper. Ben and I corresponded around some of this about 2 years ago, I think it was. And this quote from Ben is in the book. Ben, he notes that in Kenya, by contrast to the examples I've described to you of strong top-down governance, weak participatory governance, in Kenya, where the bureaucracy in a standard sense is weaker than the bureaucracy in the Western Cape, there are powerful norms and expectations of performance. In Kenya, a principal gets a parade when a school does well. When a school does badly in Kenya, that principal is forced out by the community. Discussion in the book of what the historical roots of that are in the Kenyan case, but the contrast is striking. And that leads me so my first set of propositions was around agency at the school level and the potential for intervening there if the power dynamics are not too perverse. My second set of conclusions are conclusions about the prospects for process compliance. And this final conclusion I will make in 3 ways. First, I'll make it this way. Sometimes it's better to be messier. If we contrast being in a space of full coherence but weak alignment to learning with a messier environment bureaucratically but a stronger alignment to learning, our results suggest that this produces better outcomes than this. That's the first way to say it. Another way to say the same thing is top-down command and control cannot unlock a low-level process compliance equilibrium. I'm sometimes tempted to quote, maybe it's apocryphally Einstein here. Madness means doing the same thing again and again and expecting a different result the next time. One more cycle of process compliance, one more cycle of top-down intervention is not going to break that. To see that differently, the challenge is a challenge. If you're going to want to unlock a low-level equilibrium, the challenge is to do that in a way that shifts all stakeholders, which brings me to my very last slide. How do you unlock a low-level equilibrium? And I want to just make 3 points on how you unlock it. It'll be very fast, Lant. It'll be 30 seconds. First, the first thing is, if you want to transform a system, you need to transform the invitation to all the stakeholders in a society. So unlocking a low-level equilibrium means shifting from saying schooling is the responsibility of government to schooling is everybody's responsibility. How do you make that broad-based political shift? Second, if you want to do that, the task is to create space for innovators. And in order to create space for innovators, especially in environments that are preoccupied with process compliance, it means creating space for more messiness. And then third and finally, in the spirit of if you want to know where you want to get to, you need to know what direction you're traveling in, is the case for supporting all of that, consistent with our themes today, support all of that with measurement put into the public domain to guide and incentivize the actors whose energies are unleashed in this way. And that's a governance take on education. Thank you.
Thank you very So, thank you for sticking with us through the day and a lot of talks today already. I'm going to be talking about South Africa as well. Some of the similar issues as Brian was talking about, but from a somewhat different perspective. I'm going to be talking about trust and accountability. There we go. So this is a study that was funded by the ESRC and the Department for International Development in the UK. It's a study about accountability, capacity, and trust, and particularly how accountability and trust interact to improve systems, or in the case of South Africa, prevent improvement of learning outcomes. And let me start by giving you some background, because the background of South Africa is really important here, particularly to understand issues of trust and accountability. And this will not be news for you, but it's important to kind of highlight those contextual issues when we start talking about research like this. So South Africa is a highly unequal system. Some people even talk about it being two systems, where the apartheid history has created that divided system. And the picture of the two schools here quite vividly pictures the two systems and the differences between some of the schools that you would find in the country. In 1996, when apartheid was abolished, national government introduced quite a lot of policies to establish one system, introducing a national curriculum, for example, introducing all types of quality assurance policies to ensure improvement of particularly former black schools, and to create a more homogeneous system. But up until today, there is still quite a high inequality within South Africa. So how can we understand that from issues of trust and accountability? That's the key question underpinning our study. How do trust and accountability interact to prevent sustainable and scalable capacity for improvement in South Africa's system of basic education? So this is the first piece of work within a larger study where we did a systematic review to collate all the studies done in this area. We did a review in 4 phases. I won't go into detail, but just to say that the final synthesis included 38 sources, which were all set in South Africa and addressed issues of accountability, trust, and how those relate to learning outcomes. So let me unpick trust and accountability before we go into the findings, because trust and accountability, those are two very generic terms, and they can be interpreted in many different ways. So how we understood trust and accountability is by looking at it from 2 different perspectives. So on the one hand, you can look at trust and accountability as system level indicators where you have an accountability system in place, but where trust is also defined on the system level as a culture of trust or a culture of distrust, where we know that on international league tables which measure trust, for example, by the OECD or by the Edelman barometer, South Africa scores quite low in issues of general trust, trust that people have in unknown others in the country. In this study, we particularly understood trust and accountability from the interpersonal or interorganizational level. So looking at issues of trust and accountability within relations in the education system. And here we understood our accountability as the extent to which actors are held accountable for their behavior and performance by other actors in the system, And we also looked at trust within those relations. And there we define trust as a willingness to take a risk based on an assessment of someone else's competence, benevolence, and integrity. And you can immediately see that when you look at these definitions, there is a relation between trust and accountability. Because if we understand trust from the perspective of someone else's competence or benevolence or integrity, accountability can support that by giving information about someone else's competence, but also by creating an equal set of standards to which people can be held accountable and which creates a sense of fairness in how people interact with each other. So when we think about trust and accountability, this is a quote that is often used and really vividly kind of pictures what we are talking about here. Should we just trust schools and teachers? Do we even need to hold them accountable when we talk about performance? Can we even trust and control at the same time? Those are some of the questions that we're asking in this study. Trust is good, maybe control is better. And this particular question has been hypothesized in the literature where colleagues describe 3 different perspectives on whether trust and control or trust and accountability can feature in the same relation. The first one is saying no, or the first one is a complementary perspective, saying that trust and control can actually build on one another. Trust can reinforce control, can make control more effective, or control can actually improve trust, such as when giving information about someone's performance actually confirms initial positive assumptions about someone's perceived trustworthiness. The second one is a substitution perspective, saying that if you trust someone, there is not really a need to control, and the control just adds transaction costs to a relation. It's just costly to control and monitor someone. So if you can trust someone, there is not really any need for monitoring. The third one is an inverse perspective, saying that trust and accountability cannot be part of the same relationship. If you collaborate, if you have a collaborative relationship, then introducing control into that relationship can actually reduce trust. So we were trying, through the literature review, trying to understand across the relations in the South African education system, how trust and control feature within these relations. And this is a figure by Dossing et al., work from Transparency International, picturing the education system in South Africa and the various relations within the education system. And we used that to develop this framework in which we mapped the actual accountability relations and the formal ones. And what I'll do here is to particularly talk about the accountability relationship between the district and schools. So if we look at the formal accountability relations between the district and schools, then there are formal mechanisms or interventions in place where schools have to meet a national curriculum and assessment policy, and where they have to log whether they are implementing the national curriculum in a school information or educational management information system. They have to log teacher and student attendance rates, and curriculum and subject advisors frequently visit the school to check whether the school is implementing the national curriculum and are providing advice and support on how to improve that implementation. That's what the formal accountability relation looks like. And this is an example of what that would look like where learner books are being checked for activities completed, number of days the work was completed, and giving more qualitative comments on how that needs to be improved. So that's what it's supposed to look like. So our literature review particularly looked at what does this actually look like in practice. And then you see a very different picture emerging. Then you see a picture emerging of infrequent visits where teachers talk about the accountability being a very tick box exercise where they just fill in forms, they send that into the district, they ask for support, and then nothing happens. So this understanding of also that they have to meet accountability targets and standards on curriculum implementation, activities that they have to implement, that's unfeasible, particularly in schools in rural areas where they have very large classrooms, multi-grade teaching, and where it's unfeasible to meet those targets. And this quote particularly highlights that as well. This is a principle talking about the challenge of meeting those standards, saying that they are in the annual teaching plan required to implement certain type of activities, but then they're also being told if children don't understand the content, you need to be reteaching. But then they're being held accountable on actually implementing a set of activities in a structured format. So the accountability actually doesn't allow them to reteach and to differentiate their teaching towards what learners need. So when we map that onto our framework of trust and accountability, we begin to understand how this very formal bureaucratic accountability is actually limiting trust within that relation, how we see an inverse perspective of trust and control emerge within that particular context. We see that a lack of capacity, particularly in districts, to monitor schools effectively, to provide advice that is helpful to schools, reduces trust within that relationship. We see that there's an understanding of the accountability being very unfair, particularly to schools in rural areas who are being forced to meet standards that are beyond their reach. We see a lack of support where the accountability exercise is very bureaucratic, and even when schools and teachers ask for support, they don't receive it. So the entire accountability exercise becomes meaningless and dysfunctional, and as a result reduces trust between schools and the district. Another really important understanding here, particularly for South Africa, is that accountability, the term has a certain, it raises a certain understanding in schools. And the apartheid regime has an important kind of context to it to understand how schools and teachers understand accountability. They understand it as something that is there to ensure compliance and obedience. They understand that control is there to make sure that they implement national legislation and meet policy requirements. They don't understand accountability in many schools as something that is there to support teaching and learning. So how we understand the relation between trust and control also has a temporal embeddedness almost. So to conclude, with 1 minute left, trust and control can be seen as a reinforcing loop, but whether that is positive or negative will vary across contexts. And whether it's positive or negative depends on how control is implemented, if it's reciprocal, if it's followed up with support, if it's meaningful for improvement of schools. We also need to understand it from a historic and cultural context and whether there is available capacity to monitor effectively and to also act on recommendations from monitoring visits will matter if both are positively reinforcing one another. And then a final question that I haven't answered yet is whether you can actually have one accountability system for such an unequal system, and whether it's fair to have the same type of accountability system for schools that are facing so different circumstances and contexts. And I want to leave it with that. Thank you.
Thank you for repeating back to me. Everyone else was quiet. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin Piper, and along with my colleague Joe DeStefano, as well as two co-authors who aren't with us today. One is a national coordinator of the program we'll be talking about. The other is a project director, Esther and Salome, respectively. We're going to be talking about a paper called Scaling Up Successfully, Lessons from Tusome and Kenya. I think it's important as the presentation comes to change the punctuation mark. It has a colon, it should be a question mark. Scaling up successfully. What we're trying to do in this particular presentation is talk about an opportunity we had to work with the Kenyan government, led by the Kenyan government, to move from a pilot, a medium scale pilot called Primer, here at the top, which was implemented in almost 1,400 schools, supporting 250,000 children, with RCTs randomized at the cluster level. I want to get on my high horse about this point. If we want to design programs, pilots for scale, if systems do things at cluster levels, we should randomize at the cluster level rather than the school level, which makes, therefore, the standard errors clustered at that cluster level, which makes it harder to get statistically significant effects, but makes it so you're testing the realities of the system. Okay, I'm off my soapbox. Primer was implemented in 3 subjects, and it was a test to see whether or not the system in 1,400 schools can improve outcomes. So again, scaling up successfully, can you take a program that showed significant impacts on learning across these 3 subjects in 1,300 schools? What happens when you scale up to every single public primary school in the country, as well as 1,500 low-cost private schools? The numbers are there, supporting 75,000 plus teachers. We've worked with the government to deliver over 25 million books. Every school in the country. Can the same program that worked at pilot work at scale? This is the president of the country. He launched the program. This is government-owned, government-led. They're the ones who do the training. They're the ones who develop the materials. They're the ones who do it with technical support from RTI. Full disclosure, I used to lead the program. Now I'm supervising it. So it has 4 key features. I'm going to go through these quite quickly. The first part of the presentation I'm giving to you now is the intro. Joe will talk about this process of scaling up, and then I'll share some results at the end. We're dancing back and forth to keep you awake. So the first key feature, our books one-to-one for every kid in the country. In both subjects, every child has a book. That's important because it's necessary for the teacher to distinguish children who are just mimicking reading from actually reading. If they have the book in front of them and track with their finger, you can differentiate whether the child just has the ability to say the words or they actually know what those words mean and can read them. Key feature number 2 are structured teacher's guides that are connected to the books. So every teacher has a teacher's guide for both subjects. The teacher's guide has the pages from the book embedded, as well as several different activities that they are encouraged to do on that particular day. They don't have to follow it, but as you'll see later on, most of them do follow the teacher's guide pretty closely. The third key feature is skill-based teacher training. This is a typical rural training venue, except for the random person in the middle of the picture. And what we want to think about how to make happen is how do you help these typical non-residential, on-the-ground training venues become places not just to be lectured at, but instead places where teachers have the opportunity to practice the skills that are fundamental to the program's success. So if you have visited a typical training session, is everyone sitting and listening, or are they practicing comprehension strategies? Are they practicing vocabulary strategies? And whether or not programs are successfully able to scale up will determine whether that can happen in a regular place in a rural part of the country. The fourth key feature is focused and frequent training, where coaches on the left After they visit the classroom of the teacher on the right, they're giving them feedback based on the actual lesson that they taught. The coach has a tablet. The tablet is structured with a tool that would allow the coach to observe the lesson, seeing how well they're doing particular portions of the lesson, and then to suggest to the coach some discussion points they could make to the teacher. But the key point is that this interaction is supposed to happen frequently, and it's supposed to be related to specific instructional behaviors that teachers do or don't do. That's the fourth key feature, and then I'm turning over to Joe.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, everybody. So the reason we're doing this together in part is also because when Ben, who's responsible for managing this massively successful program, which he'll show data on shortly, was being pestered by me for quite a long time about how do we understand what's the mechanism through which this is succeeding? How did it go to scale successfully? And so after bugging him frequently enough about that, he invited me to write this paper with him to try and explain it. And so going back to some work that Louise Crouch and I had done a couple of years ago, trying to say, I think out of guilt for years of having worked on designing really complex reform programs, we felt, is there a way to turn this on its head and say, instead of saying you have to fix everything in the system, are there a few core things that really matter? And so some of the core things that we came up with was setting and communicating expectations, and the idea of expectations for learning outcomes specifically, but then also expectations for what teachers are supposed to do to produce those outcomes, and what the system is supposed to do to support teachers so that they can do that. Then monitoring and accountability in relationship to those expectations, and then ensuring the basic inputs so that those expectations can be met, but then also based on the monitoring, intervening in response to what the monitoring shows. So thinking about this as not letting schools fail, not letting children fail, but thinking about how the system responds to that positively. So let me show examples of how these core functions were evident in Kenya. So the one key thing was, Brian, you talked about the league tables in Kenya, which are based on things like the end of primary exam. But with this program was focused on early learning, and so we had to set benchmarks for outcomes that had meaning in terms of class 1 or class 2. And so these are examples of benchmarks for reading proficiency based on oral reading fluency. There's a lot we could criticize about using oral reading fluency. The point I want to make here is not so much whether that was a great benchmark or a not so great benchmark, the idea of having it and putting it into concrete terms for teachers, and that this was part of their training, that they would learn about what this meant and that this is what they should be expecting to see in their children. So a key change in sort of what the expectation was for teachers is that now they're thinking about outcomes in very tangible terms. Another aspect of expectations was the expectations for teachers that they were getting these materials, the teacher guides that Ben mentioned, the textbooks at a 1-to-1 ratio for their students, and then the expectation that they would use them. And so we have data on whether they were using them or not, and you could see, for example, this is from towards the end of the school year, I think a month before the school year was scheduled to end. So there were 150 lessons in the teacher's guide, which the teacher is supposed to cover. And you could see that at the 75th percentile, teachers were getting to 137 out of the 150 lessons by a month before the end of the school year. So fairly good. And you can see it in percentage terms. At the 75th percentile, they were at 91% of the intended lessons, 50th percentile, 84%. At the 25th percentile, they were at least 75% of the lessons were getting. So 75% of the teachers were teaching at least 75% of the lessons, which is a fairly good measure of uptake within the system. And so this expectation of the teachers using the materials on a day-to-day basis in their classroom was to a fairly high extent being met. Another core function, which is the monitoring, relates to the other key feature which Ben was mentioning, which is the regular coaching. And so the intent of the coaching was to help the teachers. But a side benefit of it was that it would produce data on whether the visits were being done and what the teachers were actually doing when they were being visited. So a key thing, this entire monitoring system was able to be set up because the coaches were using tablets. So each time they would visit the school and make an observation, it would be registered in the system. And so this is, for example, the output for 1 month, for the month of March this year. There were 16,500 observations completed during that month, and in about a fifth of the schools were visited in that month. And so this just shows that on a month-to-month basis, the system is now able to monitor whether the coaching function is actually being performed. And that's also monitorable in a GPS system because the tablets are GPS enabled, and you could drill down on each dot. I won't spend a lot of time on that. But here's an example then. Thank you. You mentioned league tables as sort of something that is a feature of the Kenyan system. And so the idea of having data that can compare performance is sort of a given. But here we're looking at performance of coaches in terms of whether they were doing the desired level of visits to the schools in a given month or over the course of several months. And so these are at the county level. You can see, for example, the first county, I hope you can see, Baringo has got 98% of the intended visits. If you look at the third one, Bugamo, they only got 17%. So being able to show this data in a forum among county administrators, among coaches, and then be able to drill down within a county to the sub-county level, to each coach level, and sort of have tangible accountability about who was getting the job done, who wasn't getting the job done. The important thing is this was all soft accountability. There were no sanctions or rewards associated with it. It was just making the information available for people to look at and hold each other accountable, hold themselves accountable about whether they were getting the job done. So there's an aspect of change in organizational culture that is something that I think is really important as an aspect of how this was successful. The last thing of ensuring basic inputs, here's an image of the millions of books that have been mentioned that were being distributed. And the project was instrumental in setting up a counterexample of how one could go about procuring books at lower cost, insufficient quantity, and getting them out to schools on time, which again is another signal to the system that things are different. And for a good portion of the time it was supported by the project, but then the government is now taking this up as how they're doing the distribution of materials. So making materials available, it showed that the system was holding up its end of the bargain. If we have these expectations for students, these expectations for teachers, here now the system is delivering its side. So it's a two-way accountability. The system is giving you the materials you need. Now we can fully expect you to deliver the results. The data used to target weak implementation, so coaches could follow up on weak teachers in schools. So the tablet, as Ben was mentioning, produces data on how well the teacher delivered the lesson. That data could be looked at systematically and identify areas of weakness and strength, et cetera. And there's some other examples here I'll skip over in order to allow time for Ben to tell us or show evidence that Tusome did work.
Maybe. Okay, so did it work? So this is an external evaluation done by MSI, published in 2017. The identification strategy was not really an identification strategy. You had a national sample in 2015 and then a repeated cross-section in 2016 in the same 204 schools, assessing 5,000 kids. There were 14 assessments in the two languages of English and Kiswahili. Basically, here are the results. These are mean outcomes, baseline, midline. What I want you to look at are each row is a different task. This is for Kiswahili. If you look here in class 1, baseline was 16 on letter sounds, midline was 29. Which is bigger, midline or baseline? That's all I want you to think about. For class 2, midline, baseline, which one is bigger? Midline. But in a lot of these comparisons, you're looking at about a doubling. So particularly if you look at the fluency, 5 becomes 12, 14 becomes 24. So most of the estimates for both English and Kiswahili were twice as high 1 year later in the same schools. Impacts, again, this is on fluency. In English, the results are basically the same. 10 words a minute become 22, 24 becomes 44, a doubling of learning outcomes at the national level. From an effect size point of view, for grade 1, we're talking about a 0.5 standard deviation effect size, full standard deviation across the 2 years. and in class 2 was 0.9 for English and 0.7 for Kiswahili. Basically, for the kids for class 2, they actually had the program for a year and a half, as opposed for class 1 who had it a little bit less than a year. I don't think we have much time to look at the benchmarks, but just a quick figure. Different colors relate to different levels of the benchmark. Dark blue is very good, red is 0. Okay, so if you look at the class 2 outcomes, there were 38% 0 scores, which puts Kenya in line with most of the other countries in the region. 38% became 12%. The percentage of kids who are at the top benchmark, 12, became 27. If you add these two up, the kind of two top benchmarks, 34%, became 65%. So you're doubling the percentage who can really read. Basically, we put it like this. If you count the kids who have now hit the benchmarks at the top end, as well as those who are no longer 0 readers, at the term of this midterm external evaluation, 1.2 million children could be plausibly said to be able to read better as a result of the program. If the magnitude of the effects continued since then, it would be about 3 million kids with causal impacts on learning outcomes. Now, I bet everyone wants to know how things have changed since the midterm evaluation. I don't have time to tell you, other than to say the coaching data that I can show you now is not designed for an impact evaluation. But if you look here, grade 1 is this row, grade 2 is this row, grade 3 is this row. This is Kiswahili, that's English. Each of these dots are estimates from the coaching data on learning outcomes. And basically, since year 2, which is the 2016 year, for most of the comparisons from the coaching data, in both year 4 and year 5, outcomes are a little bit higher. We are not saying we're going to have higher outcomes than they were there, but the trends, at least from the coaching data, might suggest that that's possible. Reflections in my negative 22 seconds. The changes in expectations were backed up by action that has been able to make some system level improvement. There's a change culture. Joe talked about the soft but meaningful accountability. It's worth noting that the government spent their own money to print books, these books in schools, and deliver them this year. They've actually used a system of procurement to do that for the entirety of the new curriculum reform they've done, and I think they've delivered somewhere in the around 15 million books using the same method and using the same model. We are interested in this idea of scaling up. There's a study funded by Gates Foundation we're getting to work on with CGD called the Learning at Scale study to look at examples of successful programs that have changed the question mark to a colon, learning, scaling up successfully, and we'll be talking a little bit more about this at the COP meeting on Friday. Thanks, everyone.
Sorry, bro, I ran a little over.
Hi, so I'm a little embarrassed at being here again with you having seen me earlier today, but trust me, my students have it worse. So this is just you sharing in that community of practice. Essentially, we were expecting certain government approvals to have come in by now, and they haven't, so we wanted to not give up the slot. You never give up the slot. And instead, we'll be presenting to you other stuff that the RISE India team has been doing with governments at scale. And to say that, you know, I mean, we think there's great potential for just working with governments at sort of the scale that I wish I could change outcomes at. And so this is going to be optimistic me. It wouldn't feel like it for a while, but trust me, there's good stuff by the end, okay? What this follows on is on the things that we had spoken about at this conference last year. And essentially, it comes to the fact that whatever else you want to do around systems, one of the things that we really want to do is make sure somebody is measuring what outcomes are, and make sure that in some sense we can trust how that measurement is done. And what I want you to think about is think of just making sure of the quality of the information that you're basing decisions on as a fundamental constraint for state capacity in education systems. It also happens that that's something that we agreed to as a SDG goal. It's also what the World Bank says you should be doing. So it would be good if we sorted this out, okay? So what does that look like in multiple education systems within India? And I want to essentially focus on two things. The first bit is really what I had looked at last year, which is how big is distortion in large-scale testing, okay? And when I say large-scale, I'll be talking about annual standardized tests that cover about 7 million kids every year, yeah? So large scale. And really today is more about this is the kind of information we would really want to collect. This is stuff that we wouldn't be able to do without, and this is the world that we have to live in. So is there something we can do, conditional on constraints, to make the information more reliable, right? And more reliable in a way that could be done across all schools, because of all the research teams here, we know how to do it in 50 to 100 schools well by sending other people to do it, right? I mean, it's not that the technology to administer an exam paper is unknown. What is unknown is, can you get the state to run it with the employees they have enrolled, okay? Think of that as the overall picture that we want to deal with. I'm going to say this is good. This matters for policy, this matters for research, but yeah. So the two states I'll be talking about, one is going to be Madhya Pradesh, which is a really large state in the center. The other is Andhra Pradesh. I will talk a bit more about this, okay? Madhya Pradesh literally means central provinces, which unsurprisingly is in the center of the country. It is large, okay? It's 75 million people. It's 110,000 public schools. We are going to look at data that's representative in 10 districts out of 52. Somewhere in the room is Aditi Bhaumik, who was part of the JPAL team at the time we were collecting this. Yeah, sorry, she walked out in the right talk. Okay. Yeah, well, reveal preference. She knows the results, though, okay? And I'm going to be looking at these assessments called Pratibha Parv, which started around exactly the kind of push that many people in this room would like to have. Okay, so the government decided in 2011 that they really needed to track learning outcomes. They wanted to do this as a census so that every school felt that it had to track learning outcomes, it had to focus on learning, it had to achieve. So they didn't want to do it on the kind of sample surveys that you can control quality on. And the way it happens is it's a mix of grade appropriate test questions. Some of it is multiple choice, some is not. Nearly everything is focused on knowledge and recall of facts. That is also true of the Indian education system, okay? So it looks like Indian exams. In terms of administration, there's a standardized question paper that's set at the state level. It's sent to all schools. It is unsealed from these sealed envelopes on the day of testing. You get parents to come in. You have what are called flying squads, and I'm told this is only Indian terminology, but it means sets of people who are meant to possibly turn up at your school in unannounced visits to see if you're to see that everything's being done the right way. And then you have a day of wanting to communicate these results with parents. Okay, so this is really them trying to take seriously what people in this room say. This is also, so that's the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. This is an official national best practice. The current draft of the National Education Policy, the first major revision since 1986, says we should be doing this in all states. Okay, so whether or not you care about this particular state, you really should care. Okay, yeah. No, actually, I'm not going to bother with that. This slide existed last year, and everything else is going to be new. So bear with me. But this would be kind of the money slide. What we did was these tests happen in December. We go back and in February ask the same child the same question. Okay, and across a set of questions. So here, each dot is a question that was common across when we went and tested kids. So on the x-axis is what proportion was reported as answering it correctly in the official test. Right, so take, say, this item 30, about 50% of kids were reported as getting it right. In the official data, it's about 30% when we go and ask. And what I want you to keep in mind is that if stuff was equal, it would be where these green lines are. It is never at the green line, okay? It is never at the green line. It is particularly far from the green line for easier things. So the moment you want to look at minimum proficiency levels, you'll be particularly far out. The short message is there is no learning crisis in official data as they exist. Okay, that's the de facto state. This is a representative sample. This is about 300 odd schools. Okay, so that's class 5 and class 8. And if you sort of just look at where in the distribution are you manipulating? Oh, sorry, is the distortion the highest? Is the highest for the weakest kids. Okay, and that's kind of consistent with the stories that we are hearing that, I mean, if there isn't the space to do remediation, if remediation is costly, it takes effort, and if I'm going to get just lots of grief about having reported that kids at the bottom can't read, well, those are the kids that I want to push further up, right? So you can see what the difference between the proportion who reported answering correctly on the end line, and it's obviously a lot smaller at the upper end. Is this just that people weren't taking it seriously when we turned up with tests? Well, one way of trying to think of it is that in classes 5 and 8, you sent the scripts to a different school for grading. Okay, so think of this as the system kind of acknowledging that this is a system where people may cheat, and in particular where we may be manipulating grades. And what can you do at scale? You can't send external auditors to 100,000 schools. Okay, like that kind of scale doesn't exist. What you can do at most is get them to swap answer scripts. Yeah. Now, if it is true that at least some of this is coming out of teachers wanting to grade up their kids, two things should be true. One, the degree of mismatch should be lower in the grades where somebody else corrected scripts. And the other, that if it was a grade where the script was assigned, was checked by somebody else, in those grades, there should be more signal in being reported to answer correctly, right? So I mean, we would think that that's a bit more true. This is one of those cases where the numbers are actually easier. Okay, so here's how you should think about this. In grades where the teachers mark their own scripts, you see about 60 percentage points higher reported scores in math, about just under 40 percentage point higher reported scores in language. Math, these questions are so hard that by the time we go and ask them, we're typically getting about 10% odd correct on things that aren't multiple choice. Okay, that reduces by about a third, slightly more than a third, in the grades where somebody else is grading those scripts. Okay, so part of this really does seem to be something about inflation of grades, but there's enough appreciation here, even otherwise. Okay, and a different way of trying. Yeah, I'm not going to actually explain the specification, but let me just explain the numbers. A different way of trying to say this is within grades, how much does me having answered correct, being reported to answer correctly in December, have information about whether I answer correctly later? Well, in the grades where somebody else graded me, you have about 3 times more information in math, about 50% more information in Hindi, right? And so this clearly seems to be a large-scale issue there. Let me spend the last 5-7 minutes about new stuff since last year, where I mean, we come and we see Jishnu present things about, well, if you were able to inform communities about how well schools are doing, then you know what, you'll get these gains and they don't fade away and they're there 8 years later. Being me, and as we've established, I am a depressive person. I ask, well, how do I find out which schools do better when everybody marks themselves up? Okay, so think of this as now, fortunately, so there's people from Central Square Foundation here who have a long-standing relationship with the government of Andhra Pradesh. Andhra Pradesh really wants to move towards these kind of league tables, towards trying to directly inform parents, towards incentivizing schools to improve. It's also one of the states that has a bit more of a reputation of actually pulling implementation off. Okay, and to anyone who's worked with governments on large-scale programs, that's a godsend, right? Well, it's big. It's like about 49 million people. Also, a lot of what you know about Indian education, you really only know for Andhra Pradesh. Okay, so this is like the modal Indian education. Yeah, so it's in southern India, this long strip, and again, we're going to be in one district, but we're going to be in every school in that one district. Okay, so everything's still at the kind of scale that I couldn't stuff up. It's a district called Prakasham, and the intervention is fairly straightforward. The intervention is, again, starting with an objective function that the government really wants a census, and I can't put enough bodies on the ground to make sure this is external. Can we use tablets in some way to try and get past these constraints? Why do we think these might help? Well, there's 2 things. One, we think a lot of this is coming out of student copying, and then you can jumble answer scripts, right? So different students are answering different questions at a point in time. The other is that all the grading moves to being automated. So even if you want to bump up your students, you just can't because you never asked to grade script. it's also possible to get buy-in because no one who's in a teaching job would deny that grading scripts is amongst the dullest tasks that any teacher has to do, right? So it's one of those things that you can possibly get buy-in for, where you can possibly future-proof, and yet there's like a massive potential risk, right? Especially if you start looking at minimum proficiency benchmarks. Tablets are not all that familiar across all parts of a state, even like Andhra, right? So maybe all you pick up is that people don't know how to answer stuff in tablets. Okay, so that's what we try to do, and just logistically, can government systems do this? Yeah, and that's a huge thing. What we do, and by we I mean us and Central Square Foundation and the government of Andhra Pradesh, they wanted to test all students present in any government or private school in the entire district. So now we're talking about 2,400 schools, which is still incredibly large. It only sounds small compared to the 100,000 I was talking earlier, right? Or compared to the many schools that Ben was just talking about. So if you just move apart from those two presentations, this is a lot of schools. Okay, and what we do is we randomize whether you were tested using tablets or whether you were tested using paper-based tests in the way that typical government tests happen. Going back to singing from Ben's hymn book, this is randomized at a higher cluster level, which is larger than a village, because we didn't want one school to be tested by a tablet, the other by a paper within the same geography, and partly because if stuff worked, we wanted to figure out if we can do information interventions and, like see if we could learn from Jishnu. Yeah, those are general life goals. But the tests are designed to capture wide variation. They're all reasonable. The core testing happened in slightly more than 2,400 schools. In 120 schools, we went back and retested same kids on the same items because we want to be able to distinguish things that are happening out of exaggeration versus just familiarity effects, right? I mean, you didn't know how to answer stuff on tablets. And the important part there is that is going to be a paper and pen test. It's going to have 80% of the same items, okay? So, and you just want to see two things: how different do results look, and do they differ across private and government schools? That's testing happening on tablets. That's the money slide, which is, this is the proportion who gets stuff right when we go and test it. This is the proportion who get it right across the two arms. So, being somewhat unfair to CSF, I call it the CSF test. But what this says is, this red line is essentially the fit for each item in the tablet version. And the tablet version essentially lines up almost perfectly. They're doing slightly worse than when we go and retest them, but the difference is kind of 2 percentage points, right? I mean, you're within spitting distance of what our retest shows. On the other hand, the moment you start looking at the paper one, you get exactly similar patterns as you were getting in MP, which is that there's more exaggeration at the bottom margin, at the easier items, and that's the core side. It turns out that government systems could do this in an entire district as a census. The difference here is about 17 to 20 percentage points. But remember, this is a no-stakes test. It's just that in an environment where you're used to tests having consequences, and you're used to thinking that, well, copying happens fairly frequently. And incidentally, in case you think this is not copying, well, I can send you a whole folder of media articles which say this is copying, okay? And we also spent 2 years going back to schools and just sitting and seeing it in schools. Well, turns out that you can't reject that essentially in the tablet version you're getting the same, and this is essentially each item at an individual level, right? So each individual answers about 30-odd questions, and whether those line up across the two, you can't reject that the tablets have almost the same.
On another slide.
Okay, done.
Okay.
Done.
Okay.
Yeah.
Get a chair.
All right.
Come on up, everyone. beauty, I think. Oh, yes. We got it. You got it. As promised, it was intriguing, varied, and system-focused session. I'm not going to abuse my role as chair and ask a question. I'm going to turn to the audience. So why don't we start with Nick, then Amanda. I'm blanking on your name, but sorry. Okay. So Nick, Amanda, then the other one.
Thanks. The question is for Ben.
Oh, maybe you should say your name in spite
Nick,
of the fact that I
hi.
just said it.
Nick Spall from Stellenbosch in South Africa. My question is for Ben. I've seen this like 6 times. It's as impressive every time. The question is about the embeddedness of this within the Kenyan system. So this is a USAID funded thing. When you guys pull out, hopefully the government agrees that this is a great thing to do and keeps doing it. But can you comment particularly on like the curriculum reforms in Kenya, the 21st century, fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence stuff, and how that impacts on your project? And kind of, yeah, just generally the embeddedness of this type of an approach when it's been done at scale.
Okay. Amanda?
My question's also for the RTI team, which is, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the differences between primer and Tusome, meaning, so like, you know, what changed? There must have been something that didn't work with, I mean, maybe not, but with scale. So you found these really impressive results with primer. What's not working? What isn't what is working? What didn't work with Tusome? And from the perspective of just kind of like process, but also in terms of, you know, impact, as you say, like just in terms, like, did you see as a big of a change in learning when you went to scale?
Hi, Judy Schipper, Torweza. 2 questions for Abhijit. Fantastic presentation, thanks. I was intrigued by the fact that you worked with the government of Madhya Pradesh, and so they are interested in actually finding out about misreporting in their system. Maybe you can talk about that. Second thing, last year Derek Neal in Oxford talked about not using 2 systems, one system of testing for 2 different functions. It looks a little bit like you still want to use one system of testing for both finding out about learning progress and for accountability. By tweaking it, maybe you could give your thoughts about that.
You're not going to ask a question of Abhijit, are you? Okay, Kartik.
Question for Ben again. So sorry. So question for Ben, and just in terms of understanding who of the actors were external and which of them were internal. So the coaches are, because, I mean, in some ways, if you look at the paper we presented last year on the MP intervention that was trying to do stuff at scale that failed, it was exactly this additional level of pedagogy support, that we were trying to get the government to put in, but most of what they focused on was getting the school report cards and improvement plans. And so everything that you see down to the level of the plans looks great on paper. That's channeling, I think, some of the presentation, I think the second presentation on accountability, right, which is paper. Everything looks great on paper, but nothing's changed in the classroom, right? So it feels like that coaching piece and the tablet-based follow-up is critical. So are those all Government of Kenya employees who are then trained and able to scale, or what fraction of those were external actors?
Okay.
And sorry, and just a question on cost, right? In the end, just in terms of cost per child per standard deviation, or if you were to calculate that number and benchmark that relative to what we have so far, that'd be great.
Okay, the next round of questions is going to be about accountability and systems. So let's answer this round of questions, and the audience should prepare itself for questions about accountability.
I guess I'll go first.
Yeah.
Nick, I thought we were friends. That's not the question you start with. There is a new curriculum in Kenya as of January 2019 for grade 1 to 3. Through quite a bit of complicated political economy situations, the situation we're in right now is the government has decided that in the context of this curriculum reform, the materials they're using for English and Kiswahili going forward in the curriculum are these materials, which is why they have printed them themselves and distributed them themselves this year for the first time. From a pedagogical point of view, there are still things that have proven to be complicated as they've rolled out the curriculum this year. There's just quite a bit of complexity and confusion about how the new curriculum is being rolled out. But the feedback from government and the feedback during the training is still the books that exist in the schools and still the materials that the teachers prefer to use are these ones. And the call has primarily been to government to say, can we not do this sort of thing in other subjects in addition to English and Kiswahili? So don't get me wrong, it's going to be quite complicated as any curriculum reform is, but I think those decisions by government to make these books and this system part of the scale-up of the new curriculum is essential to having a chance of making it work. As far as Amanda's question on the relationship between primary and yes?
But this kind of curriculum reform Kenya is announcing gives people from South Africa cold sweats because South Africa kind of had a similar groovy-looking 21st century curriculum reform that set learning back substantially, according to a lot of people. How worried are we about that?
Worried enough to have many articles from South Africa shared with government leaders about what's going to happen if you go that way, but not effective enough to have that affect anything in the decision-making process.
Oh yeah, no, this
Yeah,
is a huge, challenging. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
No,
I did mean to interrupt you.
okay. Forgiven. So as far as the relationship between primary and Tusome, some of the effect size is actually a bit smaller in the national scale from one of the studies we did in the rural program that had the full package. The difference, I think, in this particular case was that the pilots were a set of randomized controlled trials where we tested a variety of different conditions under which the program could work. So the scaled up program was the version amongst 8 different treatment groups that showed the most effect. At the same time, though, the idea was we are still going to have made fundamental mistakes on the scale up, and can we get quick data like Joe showed that would allow us to iterate quickly when those results in a particular part of the country were low or when there was a part of the program that was seen as less effective. So I think in this particular case, we did a large-scale, quick data analysis within the first month and a half of implementation to try and iterate and change things. So we updated materials. We run like version 7 of the content or in version 6 of the software. So expecting when you go to scale that you will definitely have something wrong. The only question is how long it takes you to find out what that wrong thing is likely a big determinant on program impact.
If I could just chime in on that, because I think the important part of it is, so the issue of usability of the materials, for example, like we went from getting it fairly wrong in the beginning under primer to like iterations of improvement until seeing that as sort of a critical factor in determining whether teachers would use these materials on a day-to-day basis. So.
Good one. To Karthik, actually this idea of learning, designing for scale, I know you have a paper out on that. I think that's a really important thing. And one of the reasons why that's important is because in primer, all of the coaches in the government schools are government officers. The people who are doing the trainings at the local level are these same coaches. The ones who are training them are government officers. So designing the pilot so that you test the ability of mid-level civil servants without incentives to really do very well. Can you get the smart marginal behavior changes necessary to have program impact? You should do that at the pilot. So when you scale up, you already have an idea that is possible. So those coaches are government officers using.
But a contributing factor was redefining that job, right? So that was a big change that was instituted, I guess, under primer even, right? Yeah. So there was it went from the old sort of inspection model, supervisory model to a coaching model deliberately, right? So that was a key to getting the government system able to provide that function.
So a quick word about cost. There's a paper we have in World Development that has a cost analysis on impact. I don't exactly remember the per student cost. I think it's a little bit less than $3.50 for the entire program, including the coaching and training, et cetera. Did we cover everything?
So Judy had a couple of questions. I mean, one is that I think and I think India might be a bit different from various other places, but we found governments very open to admitting the idea that people cheat. The fact that all of these various margins exist that governments try and working on is a deliberate acknowledgement saying that people will try and cheat. How do we reduce it? So anything where you say, well, we'll tell you how big the issue is still and whether there are marginal ways of making improvements. So both in MP and in Andhra Pradesh, these things were presented to government naturally, but much before they were presented here. That's not really been a constraint in terms of governments being willing to partner. In terms of, yeah, I mean, having different tests have different purposes. So, I mean, Noreen did a presentation about, well, how much like triage and things matter in work with technique. The honest truth is that it's very hard to sell governments on only using sample surveys because eventually they need to make decisions at units that are far too disaggregated. So at the most, you will have something be representative at the district level. A district, so MP has 110,000 schools and 52 districts. We can do the division, but that's too large. Or like in percussion, that's 2,400 schools. You tell me nothing about which of these 2,400 schools to be doing stuff in. Most variation is within district. They're just not kind of interested in just sample surveys that focus on trends. It doesn't map onto decision quantities, right? So that's the core system constraint. We know how to do sample surveys well.
By the way, we are having another paper tomorrow on cheating in Indonesia. So we sort of slipped in Abhijit's results ahead of that, but now it turns out we'll have good results because we'll be able to show two different kinds of results with two different interventions. Questions on accountability?
Hi, my name is Zainab Qureshi. I'm with the Rise Pakistan CRT. Question for Brian Levy. You talked about potentially moving a bureaucracy that's very coherent around something not aligned to learning to allow for more room for messiness, to be able to get it to be more aligned towards learning. I'm just thinking about the situation in Pakistan, for example, where the bureaucracy seems pretty coherent, but pretty unaligned towards learning, right? What do you mean by allowing for messiness? And like, how does that even work? Like, what would that entail?
Alec?
Alec, is it on? Yeah, Alec Hirschberg from the University of Pennsylvania and Rise. Two questions, I think both for Melanie, although maybe the second one is for Melanie and Brian. I think it's really important that you distinguish between accountability and control. And I also want to thank you for reviving in my mind a paper that I let go a while ago about the power of words, and that we need to think about what it means when words that we use as policy analysts, like accountability, mean very different things to the governments that we're working with. And so it's super important that, you know, if the word accountability has this meaning in South Africa, that, you know, you have to be able to separate that out. I mean, accountability in the United States means high stakes testing, and it means different things in different places. So I think that's really important. I do think, given that you kind of conflated accountability and control a little bit in your talk, and I just want to put on the table that it might be, and this might also relate a little bit to Brian, is that if we assume that the government has human capital formation as its primary goal, then that will substantially alter the question of whether accountability and trust can go together, right? So if it's human capital formation, then maybe they go together. But if it's not, if it's culture, if it's nation building, if it's what Lant has called in a paper socialization, then you get a substantially different answer, right? And maybe, and the answer might be that they can't go hand in hand because you can't trust, right? That you don't have any other way to control that the teachers are doing what you, what's the term you use, Lant? Third party, it's not third party, what's the term you use, Lant? That teaching is not third-party contractable or something like that. So it's just worth thinking about.
Why don't we settle with those two, because we have 1 minute and 24 seconds, which we have with some soft accountability. So why don't Brian and Melanie say some things?
Do you want me to say it? So yeah, a really relevant question to think about the purpose of accountability and the purpose of specific accountability measures in the country as well, and how the government understands that. I think in South Africa, accountability, when we talk about monitoring of schools, for example, by the district, or monitoring of the district by the province, also has a planning purpose. So it's very much also about collecting information and using that information to make decisions. But that link is often not very clear to schools, so they don't understand what the information is being used for, and often it's also not being used because it's incomplete, for example, or it doesn't align to how the government plans. I think there's a wider issue here, not just thinking about the purpose of accountability and how it's understood, but also how it links to coordination of the system. Yeah, and that's something that you talk about in your work as well. The alignment within the system comes into that discussion as well, I think.
Okay, so couple of thoughts. First, I'm picking up the issue of messiness as the broad framing. I mean, first, I think that we want to take learning as the goal, as our point of departure. If the goal is not learning, if the goal is another form of control, if the goal is patrimonialism elsewhere, then the invitation for messiness is not going to produce more learning. So I just want to note that. But assuming the goal is learning, and it's not a bad presumption for the Western Cape province that we looked at, let me give you two examples of what I mean by the benefits of messiness. Actually, let me preface this with a comment on what do I think would happen in these two provinces if we actually got the kind of thin accountability data on results that were described for us in both of these studies. My guess is that in the Eastern Cape, those data may or may not find their way to the schools. If they did, they wouldn't be looked at. If one did them. My guess is that in the Western Cape, they would become, as Melanie just described, a mechanism of planning and of what happens down at the school level, isomorphic mimicry in a response, given the space that you're trapped into process compliance. So how might one ease that? One example of messiness, I'll just share with you a conversation that we had with a fairly senior official inside the Western Cape province who was responsible for implementing delegation down to the district level. He bemoaned the fact in our conversation that schools weren't more like branches of banks. What did he mean? What he meant was that every bank branch is identical. And the trouble with schools is they aren't identical. And if only they were identical like bank branches, things would be much better. Now, that suggests to me that it's an example where control is trumping any sense of efficacy, agency, and messiness. So the second example, one of the really odd features of the South African school governance is that although there's a formal structure which gives a great deal of authority to school governing bodies, that formal structure has complex roots in the political economy, and it was embraced and just picked up on the top of the distribution early. But in the bottom of the distribution, it had roots in South Africa's early democratic struggle. But by the time you got probably as early as 2000, the political and the administrative leadership really found the fact that there were elected school bodies where the people who were elected changed every 3 years, noise and a nuisance. So systematically, rather than at any point saying, let's see what we can do with this governance structure to engage stakeholders more broadly, it has been kept at arm's length. Efforts that have been proposed at different points to strengthen it have been pushed aside. And when a scapegoat is sought for trying to find problems, that scapegoat turns out to be at that school level. So I think that this would be an example. And frankly, I think of this as almost low-hanging fruit in the South African case. You don't need, as you do in Latin America or elsewhere, to change any legislation. You don't need to fight that struggle for participatory school governance. All you need to do is to say, here's an institutional framework and invite and encourage, whether it's civil society actors or public funding to support them, the strengthening of it. Now that would be noisier and more complex than just trying to govern in a narrowly top-down hierarchical way. But I dare say, and it's why I made my comment about test scores elsewhere, that in this environment where scores are used as control, it will be an example of messiness that may actually produce more greater orientation to learning.
Okay. Great session. What we're moving towards is we're moving from a session on system innovation where we're talking about the messiness of systems and scale. We're going to have a short break until 5:15, and then we're going to have an invited session about hard choices, how you move from long lists of what might happen to prioritized action. And we have a very distinguished policy maker from Ghana to talk with that, mediated by Karen Mundy from the University of Toronto. And so we're moving to actually engagement with people that are engaged in these hard choices in practice, and love to learn the wisdom of that. That will be at 5:15, followed, of course, by drinks at 6:30. So we invite you all to take a very short break, only 15 minutes. We've been having half-hour breaks, short break, and then we'll move from the research to the policy engagement, and then from policy engagement, we naturally move to drinks.